Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Doug Bolton and Lisa Damour. Thank you for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Doug Bolton is a licensed clinical psychologist and director of school consultation for formative psychological services. He spent over 20 years as a psychologist and principal at North Shore Academy, a K-12 therapeutic school in Highland Park, Illinois. Dr. Bolton provides consultation, supervision, and professional development to parents, educators, and clinicians. I went like that. Parents, educators, and clinicians throughout Illinois to create communities that help foster student and staff resilience. And how wonderful for the fan community to welcome back Lisa Damour. She is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Untangled, Under Pressure, and The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, which has been translated into 23 languages. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, which is absolutely fabulous. You can find it on YouTube. She works in collaboration with UNICEF and is recognized as a thought leader by the American Psychological Association. She has also authored the monthly adolescence column for the New York Times and is a regular contributor to CBS News. And she also created, which is really amazing, I meant to tell you, Untangling 10 to 20, a digital library of premium content to support teens and those who care for them. It's really brilliant. So now let's welcome Doug Bolton and Lisa Damour to FAN.
Thank you, Lonnie.
Thank you, Lonnie, and thank you, Fan. I'm just so grateful to be here, and for all the sponsors. It's a real honor to be here.
Absolutely. Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful organization. Doug, I am so honored to get to be in conversation with you about this tremendous book. I will say to you, psychologist to psychologist, what a contribution, what an extraordinary gift to families and educators and all who care for young people. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. I listening to your bio, you're so busy. I was like, how do you have time for any of this? So thank you for being in conversation.
All right, let's get down to it. So as someone who, is in this world and thinks about these things a lot, the question I want to start with is, why did you feel this book needed to be written, and why were you the person to write it?
It's funny. I always thought it's a book that needed to be written. I just didn't know if anyone would ever read it, right? And it started at North Shore Academy. Every day I saw transformation and inspiration in the kids and families and staff that we worked with, and that we were all working together to create change. And it was a wonderful. As I was doing that, as I was noticing that, I thought, I don't want these stories to get lost. And so I started writing them down, unfortunately, just for the last couple of years that I was there. And then as COVID hit and as I was moving on to doing more consulting, people would say, do you have a book that kind of explains all this? And so I started writing during COVID, and I had time, and so I just started writing. And I knew that I liked what was happening, but I didn't know if it would be something that could contribute to the world. And an author friend of mine, Teresa Barker, took a look at it, and I said, is this a book and am I a writer? And she says, it's both. And so I feel like that's how it was born, was in that moment. And so I'm honored and hopeful that that the stories of families and the stories of students and staff, that I honor those in the book.
Well, I think you do. And I think, stories are how we learn, and stories are how things are sticky. And so I loved the stories and how you use them for teaching. So, a central topic in the book is attachment.
Yeah.
And so walk us through, how important is it? What does it mean for childhood development? Why is it such a central construct in our field?
Yeah, it was interesting. I always knew that attachment was important, but as I started diving into attachment, the learning that happened in terms of what it does for our physical health, what it does for our mental health, that it is a it is foundational for everything we do. And when we struggle with attachment, it's very, very hard to navigate any other part of our world. And so it's foundational in that it supports our academic growth, it supports our cognitive development, it supports our physical health, and it's often fraught with real challenges. And so so as a starting point, I was happy to be in a place, and to be in several places, where attachment was the very first thing that we did before anything happened. It was foundational.
So give me the how. I agree with you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you can't, you have very little if you don't have attachment,
Yeah.
strong sense of attachment.
Yeah.
Walk us through how it supports learning, how it supports relationships, like all of
Yeah.
how it supports physical health.
Yeah. So it's interesting, as I dove into this, what I realized is how connected our attachment is to our emotional regulation, and how important attachment is to quieting our nervous system. When we're in relationship and we're attuned to one another, we quiet that nervous system, and it regulates our bodies and our minds. So it makes us more available to connecting. It makes us more available to, it brings our brains alive when we can step back and not be so focused on whether we belong, whether we're connected. So in so many ways, I think that attachment and regulation are kind of a yin and yang. When we struggle with attachment, we often experience dysregulation, and our dysregulation often impacts our attachment as well.
Would you, and this is just thinking, like spitballing as
Yeah.
psychologists, is it about safety, right? Is it about like when you feel a sense of attachment, there's safety, and so then all of these things become possible, or is that too reductive?
Well, I think that it's from evolutionary biology, our need to connect and our need to be in community is profound. We would not do very well if we just had spear and fire on our own. And so our ability to be in community is essential. And when that community is threatened, it's very, very hard for us to feel that level of safety. And the thing that as I think about attachment and I think about belonging, I think there's similar impacts on our lives, and yet I think of attachment as our connection to a person, and I think about belonging as our connection to a community, and I think both turn the same levers, both in terms of our brain science and neurology, in terms of our how we can quiet or activate our nervous system in those moments. So that to me, yeah, I think that safety is talking about it as essential for safety is not reductive. I think it's foundational. Yeah.
One of the things you do in this book is you talk about the different lenses we've used to think about modifying behavior and, shaping how kids act. And so I want to actually think with you, or have you sort of unpack for us a bit, the shift you're arguing for from moving away of seeing things through a lens of motivation,
Mm-hmm.
and instead moving over more towards what you've mentioned, which is regulation. Like, walk us through that transition and why.
Yeah, it's interesting as we were a very behavioral kind of program at North Shore Academy, and then all of a sudden these fan speakers kept coming in, and I started taking a look at the research, and what I realized, and I think that Dan Pink's book Drive was one of the ones that really helped me rethink the idea of motivation. And when you see behavior through the lens of motivation, you really have two options: you can punish or you can incentivize. And what I realized is that there are times when I behave really poorly. I'm not proud to admit that, but I'm not motivated to yell at my kids. I'm not motivated to get into an argument with a colleague. It didn't seem like motivation was really the core component to what was happening. And yet this is how our society has been working for so long. And you know, in many ways it began with in the 1920s with Watson, and then Skinner, and a bunch of, and it was good researchers. But you know, by 1950, they were already seeing cracks in the impact of incentives on performance, the impact of punishment, and the impact of fear and shame on the brain. And yet we still, even though we've had research for 70 years or more saying, I'm not sure if this is right, we still are kind of clinging to that. And so what we began to look at was to see things through the lens of emotional regulation. And when we see things through a regulation lens, all of a sudden the behavior looks different. And we have different tools then that we can use. Instead of the carrot and stick, we can begin to think, okay, how can we first quiet that nervous system? How can we begin to help them regulate so they can get their best brain available to solve the problem that we're having? Stuart Shanker's work was really helpful in thinking about things through the lens of misbehavior is stress behavior. Mm-hmm. And so when kids are misbehaving, there's always a stress there that's triggering that. And what I realized is that's true for me too, right? And then I also, you know, Bruce Perry helped me see misbehavior as trauma-based behavior, that it's this activation of their nervous system due to previous trauma and associations with that trauma that then is driving the behavior. And all of a sudden, what we began to think about is we watched the people who are doing this work and who are doing this work in ways that they seemed like magicians as staff, right? What we realized was they were just great at regulating. And when we would punish kids and put them in the quiet room, the people that we had in the quiet room were the most connected and regulated people in the building. And that was the gear that was driving the machine, right? It wasn't the fact that they were punished. It was the fact that they had a place where they could go, they could get regulated, they would reconnect, and then they'd be welcomed back into their classroom community.
To put it like really into concrete terms, like give me a for instance of a kid who does something and gets a carrot and stick response versus a kid doing the exact same thing and getting a regulatory response, like something like, what do those look like on the ground?
Sure. So I was just in a therapeutic school the other day, so this is a great example. So the carrot stick response, a student comes in, he's got a football game that afternoon. The person kind of checking him into the school, they had a security guard in the school, asked to check for his water bottle. He didn't want to give him his water bottle. He blew up, threw the water bottle, swore at the security officer. And what the team then did was they walked him to a place where he could to his favorite classroom with his favorite teacher. And they had him doing stretches on the side of the room while the teacher was teaching another. He wasn't even scheduled for that class, but on the side, he was just doing his stretching to get ready for the game, you know, quieting that nervous system in a place where he had associations of safety, doing something that was regulating his body. And then the social worker came by and checked in with him and brought him back and just listened and was curious. Like once he was regulated and then he could access his full brain, he was able to say, I'm really anxious about my game, and I felt like he was stepping up on me, and I overreacted. And he said, I want to apologize. Wow. And the security guard said, no, he doesn't need to apologize. But what they said was, yeah, he does, right? Because that's an important piece of this step, is being able to then take responsibility. And even if we don't need it, that's an important skill that they're learning. It's an important way for them to be able to engage in that. And so as opposed to being right.
Yeah.
So the thing about, you know, we suspend kids, for instance, and we think we're creating safety, but what we're doing is we are doing things that undermine their emotional regulation instead of support it. And then we're only safe for 1 out of 180 days, what's that? Less than 0.5% or something like that. And the rest of the time, we have to work with somebody who's felt excluded, felt not listened to, and felt controlled by us.
Yep, I love that example of like what going towards regulation looks like, as opposed to saying, all right, you've got detention for that behavior or
Right.
whatever. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we've established attachment is key. Among other things, it helps kids feel safe. Once kids feel safe, all sorts of things can happen. Learning can happen, relationships can happen, insight can happen. You talk in the book about adults being tuned into and aware of their own attachment histories,
Yeah.
especially as this plays out then in their interactions with kids. Walk us through that.
Yeah. So one of the things that, that when we think about our dysregulation, I think about I call it the holy trinity of dysregulation. And that is feeling powerless, feeling disconnected, and feeling devalued. And these are all relational, right? And if we grow up with a solid foundation of feeling empowered, feeling valued, and feeling connected, then threats to that may not impact us as much. But if we've had histories where we're more anxiously attached, we're much more likely to experience not necessarily thinking about it, but all of a sudden we experience that dysregulation. And so, and then that dysregulation ends up impacting our ability to function in every other aspect of our lives. And so the importance of being able to support kids, especially kids who've had struggles with attachment early on. And in a lot of ways, this doesn't mean that parents have done a bad job, right? There are circumstances that make it hard to connect to our kids, or hard to help them attach. But the beautiful thing about attachment is it's not a life sentence, whatever our attachment is. And so part of our work for kids who struggle with attachment is, can we rewrite those attachment stories? But it means that as adults, we've got to really persist in the face of the ways that anxious avoidant attachment shows up, which might be rejecting, it might be humiliating. For us, it might be a flatter affect, a disconnection, it might be overly clingy. And so it's part of our work to help rewrite that so that their attachments don't get in the way and that they can be fulfilling as opposed to creating anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Does that fit?
It does. I'm going to give you a scenario and I want you to walk us through. Like,
yeah.
Okay, so, teenagers are my world. I love them. You and I both know they can be pretty provocative sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially under threat. They can be quite provocative and quite adeptly and, kind of piercingly provocative.
Yeah.
Give me for instance, of an adult who has a good, they're fortunate they have a very solid, secure attachment history responding to a provocative teenager, versus give me for instance, of how an adult who has a more fragile or problematic attachment history might respond to a provocative teenager.
I love it. And thank you, because I didn't get to the question, which is each of us, so it shows up as parents. So thank you for doing that, because it does. I think that the interesting thing is, it's not only kids who have attachment issues, right? And one of the things that I learned as I began to learn about this is, I think I was pretty well attached until about age 6, and then my parents got divorced. And in many ways, those attachments that had felt so safe didn't feel so safe. And so there are still times when that shows up for me, right? And so if you've got the interesting thing, I think, about the two scenarios you described is a person who's more securely attached, whose life and can trust relationships, can see what's happening for the adolescent as being about them and not about me.
But that kid's having a hard time.
they're having a hard time, but and they're yelling at me and threatening me or rejecting me, but that doesn't trigger all of the feelings of rejection and doesn't tap into this emotional template that was developed 40 years, 50 years ago. And so I can stay and be more patient, more present for that person than I can for than if I've had a history of rejection, where my teenager's rejection, I will feel that in a much stronger way. And it's an interesting thing. I began to notice that there were certain kids I worked better with than other kids. And I recognized that part of what I needed as a psychologist was an engagement and a reciprocity. And so I found that I struggled more with kids on the spectrum. And I'm not proud to say that, but I noticed that felt like I needed something more. And so I needed to be much more kind of attuned to myself when I was working with kids on the autism spectrum than maybe for a kid who's, my family, we grew up and at different times it was chaotic, and I felt comfortable with expressions of anger and things like that. I could handle those when students would come my way. But if I had somebody who was more rejecting in a different way or less responsive to me, I found that that's what would trigger me to be a little bit more anxious.
Isn't that, I mean, it's so like extraordinary to think about how different kids bring out different things in us.
Yeah.
And as clinicians, some we're able to work with really effectively, and some just, we're not going to be the right fit for them, or we're going to have to work really hard to
Exactly.
our best
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about trauma.
Yeah.
Big question. What's the impact of trauma on child development?
Well, there's a lot of variables, right? And Bruce Perry talks about this a lot. I really like his and Oprah Winfrey's book, What Happened to You. And what he talks about is the timing, how important the timing of trauma is. And someone who's experienced significant, maybe a significant trauma at age 2 versus multiple traumas at age 12, the 2-year-old is probably going to show more impact than the 12-year-old, even though they may have experienced different traumas. So this is another place where I began to learn what was happening in our school. And so another fan speaker, Nadine Burke-Harris, came and spoke and really helped me to understand the ACEs study, where they took a look at adverse childhood experiences, and they had 10 of those at the time, 10 adverse childhood experiences. And it was a simple survey. Did you, before the age of 18, did you experience physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, loss of a parent, family member incarcerated, family member addicted, 10 of those, right? And they did it through the Kaiser Permanente HMO. And they had 17,000 people respond. And they were shocked for a couple of reasons. The first was how they had no idea, and this is early 1990s, mid 1990s, they had no idea how prevalent trauma was. And the other piece was they had no idea the impact on physical health, mental health, and behavioral health. And so the beautiful thing about this is it was an easy study. You'd get a score of 0 to 10, but they had all the physical health, mental health, and behavioral health records.
Yeah.
And the correlations were stunning, and they were all so similar that if you had fewer ACEs, fewer adverse childhood experiences, you were protected. But almost on every form of risk factor, the more ACEs you had, the more vulnerable you were. It's discouraging to me that people are still learning about this study 30 years later, because it's so profound. But so what we learned was that I like what Gabor Mate talks about, is that trauma, the word trauma, I think in Greek, is for wound, and the wound is really the wound that happens to our nervous system. It wreaks havoc on our nervous system. And so people who've experienced trauma really struggle with being able to physically and emotionally regulate their bodies, because our brain is built to take our current experience, take a past experience, apply it to the present to predict the future. And when you have been hurt by people who are meant to care about you, or hurt in ways that are surprising and shocking, then when you meet new people, there are a lot of things that can trigger those old templates and can trigger our dysregulation. And so the thing, one of the statistics that I found fascinating as an educator is that if you've got 0 ACEs, only 3% of kids with 0 ACEs are identified as having emotional behavioral problems. But if you've got 4 or more ACEs, you're 32 times more likely. And so what I realized was, my guess is at North Shore Academy, we've got kids we are a school for kids who experience trauma. Yeah. And then our work is to fix that nervous system, to quiet that nervous system, and to help them learn how to quiet that so that they can, number one, their body can recover from the impact or the stress of the nervous system being so activated, but then also be able to engage their full brain in a way that they can't when they're experiencing trauma-based behavior.
Reactions, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, to that end, right? Okay, so your book really centers on the idea of connection and community, and using those to heal.
Mm-hmm.
Talk with us about how this works, and also talk with us about how we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of community.
Yeah. So, thank you for that question. So, it's interesting when so when you take a look at the impact of belonging, for instance, belonging solves is foundational for almost every challenge we have in our schools, and really any challenge we have with our kids. In schools, kids who experience belonging, they're more motivated to learn, they perform better academically, they're healthier, physically healthier, they have better mental health, their social skills are better, their attendance is better, all of these things, and everything's better, and it buffers the impact of stress and trauma. And so so I guess one of the questions I've been asking is, how is this not the place we start, right? If this is what a community can do, and if we take a look at in nature, it's not just humans that survive in communities. Forests are community beings, right? And throughout, the power of being a community is universal in so many ways. And so our work is to figure out, how can we embed kids in communities? Now, the challenge is that I think our sense of community has become more and more threatened, I would say. And, Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, I think shined a light on this 25 years ago. That people aren't gathering together in community in the ways that they used to, and certainly this is what I think we're finding. What's happening, I think, a lot in our world today is we get together now in many ways to achieve something, as opposed to take the time to connect with one another. So in classrooms, we work bell to bell, right? That we teach bell to bell, with the idea that it's the content that's the most important aspect of the learning. And what we know is that if we can give them some time to quiet that nervous system, to get them connected in community, that in order to access our best brains, we need to be connected in relationship, and we need to be regulated. And so, but we don't take the time to do that, right? And in our families, we're pushing more and more for, our kids are wanting this. We believe that this helps our kids be successful, to be on as many travel teams as possible, to take as many AP classes as possible, to also be in the play, and to do it. And so as families, we've begun to lose the sense of, oh, let's sit down and have dinner every night. It's more who's got the snacks for the soccer game, and who's going to take our daughter to ballet, and the ships we're just passing in the night, and I worry that that this lack of connection, this focus on what can we achieve, is taking away from this focus on how can we be attuned to one another.
So to that point, you write about how indigenous communities are
Yeah,
much better at this.
yeah,
What are they getting right? What can we take from this? What can we learn?
yeah. So, well, so when I went to North Shore Academy, there was a philosophy called the Circle of Courage, and it was a fascinating philosophy. I thought it was cognitively interesting, right? And it was developed by 3 psychologists from Augustana College, and I think it's Augustana University now, and they were studying resilience. And what they found was that in order for kids to be resilient, the community needed to meet these specific needs. And so the first need was a need for belonging, and we've talked a lot about that. The second need was a need for mastery. This idea that I'm getting better at something that's important to me, right? And I think about the idea of flow during that, like getting lost in things, and just loving the idea of learning and growing. The third was independence. This idea that I can set a goal and I've got the skills to achieve it independently, and I know when and how to access support if I need it. And then the last one is generosity. And this idea that I've got gifts that I can give to the world, and my gifts are and I've got the opportunity to express those gifts. And so as they were doing that research, one of the researchers was Martin Brokenleg, and he said, this is the basis of our Lakota tradition. And if you take a look, there's remarkable similarities when you take a look at DC and Ryan's work. I think it's relatedness, competence, and connectedness, right? No, relatedness, competence, and autonomy. That these theories just keep coming up, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so to me, there's real like that's where we begin, so that we can, when I think about how do we begin our classrooms, how can we make sure this is happening in our classrooms? How can we make sure this is happening in our families? And the thing, they called it the Circle of Courage because it was based on the medicine wheel. And so one of the things that when we would get stuck with kids at North Shore Academy, one of the things that we would do is just wonder, where's the circle broken, right? They're struggling in our community. I wonder if it's about belonging and feeling connected. I wonder if they're bored or feeling overwhelmed by what we're asking them, or just not engaged, not interested, right? If they're defiant, that probably means that they're struggling with, or too deferential, right? Too passive. It probably means they're struggling with independence.
Yeah.
And so that became part of our focus, is how can we think about kids through that lens?
You know, what it reminds me of, I had 2 sort of free associations as you were running these down. One was when I was in graduate school, one of my supervisors was helping me with a case where the person was struggling on a lot of fronts and actually misbehaving on a lot of fronts. And I remember he said, listen, people feel good about themselves for the things they do well. Like that's where self-esteem comes, right? So like the mastery piece, like it's just like you have to feel that you're doing something well to have pride. Like self-esteem comes from nowhere else.
Right.
And then the piece you said at the end about generosity,
Mm-hmm.
I really like thinking about it that way because, one of the things that comes up so often in our work and, in the world around teenagers is the idea of like kids having purpose, right? And I think it's great, but I also think my experiences for families, it's often kind of overwhelming. Like purpose sounds like, how's your kid gonna like
Right.
the world? And people, like one of my friends wrote a really funny article, like, how's my son supposed to find his purpose? He can't find his shoes, right? I think that kind of captures it.
Yeah.
But Andrew Follini at UCLA is like, no, it's not about changing the world. It's feeling that you are counted on.
Right.
others. And so that idea of generosity, like that you have a role in this organization, you have ways to contribute. We are counting on you, right?
Yeah.
I
That-
love that framing because it's so much more accessible, you
right.
know?
It gets at the mattering piece too,
Yes,
doesn't it?
yes,
So
the
this
real
is
fucking mattering.
one of the things I loved about North Shore Academy. I'm going to give a shout out to Chuck Sheftel, who did our service learning. And our service learning was not just, we would take kids who struggled in school every day and who were essentially needed to leave their home schools because of emotional behavioral problems. And we put them in a van and go to soup kitchens, to you name it, helps refugees settle. They were doing so many different things in the to play games with the elderly, do childcare, tutor second graders in a local school. So they were doing so many different things. And what Chuck would say is, I never have any problems with these kids. And there's something about, especially kids who have experienced really hard things and who are often seen as the ones who are screwing everything up, who are the burden on people, to realize, to notice, number one, I think they've got, because they've experienced themselves, they have greater empathy and they can see it in others. And they are so giving. It was always so inspiring. And so we never had behavioral problems on those trips because they were filling that need, right?
All right, there were phenomenal questions that came in from attendees. I also just want to say a lot of love for you in the question. People saying how critically valuable your work has been, game changer, card carrying fans, as somebody said. Okay, so I'm going to throw a few of these at you and then we'll come back with like a big summary
Yeah.
question before we wrap
Yeah.
up. How do we handle the aversion that our sophomore son has to being seen as soft? That it's abhorrent to acknowledge that he has hurt feelings or fear. How can we coach him to talk about his feelings versus stifle or suppress them?
Um, I've got a couple of thoughts about that one. The first comes from a good friend of mine, Dave Gleason, and he's a psychologist who wrote a book called At What Cost? Defending adolescent development at fiercely competitive schools. And what he helped me see is to begin to see these struggles through a developmental lens. And so, you know what, and he created this term, he coined this term called developmental empathy. How can we make sure that that we're matching what we're asking kids to do with where they're at developmentally? And for me, what this meant is that we don't have to take a look at what's happening right now. I think as parents, one of the things we do is we take a snapshot about what's happening right now, and we say, well, this is what they're going to be at 25. And if they're soft at 25, then how? If they refuse to be vulnerable at 15, then what's that going to look like at 25? And so much changes, right? And so much develops and changes. And I think that there's that panic that we can all get, that, oh my gosh, we just assume that they will go into the future without developing. So I think that that's one piece, is just to know that just because this is happening sophomore year doesn't mean that this is where they're going to be as a sophomore in college, right? And then the other thing, and this was a humbling thing, I think, for me as a parent, I always wanted my kids to be able to be vulnerable and to share things. And what I realized is I was the least likely person at the dinner table to share my hard day, to share something where I felt shame. And I realized if I'm that the way that, you know, kids, James Baldwin said, kids have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. And I guess the thing that if I guess I would take a look at myself, reflect on myself, and how soft do I show up in front of my kids? And can I become softer and help them see that it's okay to be soft in this family? So those are the two things that came up for me with that question.
I love it. And I also, you know, she's talking about an adolescent boy, and you're talking about being a man modeling this in your own home, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it's doubly true that the men around teenage boys need to model.
Yeah. And I thought I always had thought of myself as being open and sensitive, and what I realized was I really have not been, and that was a hard realization for me.
Oh, I love it. Okay. I work in a high school and I am currently witnessing relational aggression between students, particularly among girls, that I used to see among middle schoolers. I wonder if you've noticed this trend too and what you might attribute it to.
I haven't noticed that. I haven't been in any single school. The first thought that came to mind, although I don't love where this went, but I think it may be in the team picture of what's happening. I've got a couple of thoughts about that. The first is that I think that with COVID, I think it in some ways our social skills. Whenever someone said, "Well, they're acting younger," I do think that we're still playing a little bit of catch up. Although I think that in many ways there's less of that. I guess the other thing that I think we're seeing in our world is greater levels of scarcity, and when people are fighting, it often means that they're looking for status or they're looking for something. And I think that one of the ways that this shows up that stresses kids out, not in this case, but that stresses kids out, is how schools have bent over backwards to become more selective, to identify themselves by how many people they leave out. And then people are so anxious about, will I be included there? And I've had kind of straight A students, captains of the swim team and volleyball team, say that instead of that it's hard for them to constantly be competing against their best friends. And so I do think that in many ways we're creating situations of scarcity. But I would say that when we're seeing that kind of struggle, there's a belonging issue. So when I think of the circle of courage, it's a belonging issue. And so I'd want to try and figure out, what is their belonging like? What is their experience of belonging outside of these conflicts and within these conflicts, so that we can begin to figure out, okay, how can we quiet those nervous systems by letting kids know that they're safely embedded in a community?
I'm really loving this, like running down the circle. Is it
Yeah.
mastery? Is it autonomy? Is it contribution? Right? I mean, like such a great place to start.
Yeah, let me just throw this out there, because I think it's wonderful, and it's not well known. It's Larry Brentro, Martin Broken Leg, and Steve Van Bakern, Reclaiming Youth at Risk. So that's kind of where it started. It's a book from like the 1980s or something. They first wrote it. But the thing that I love about that book is theoretically it worked, right? So they had the theory, and then in practice it worked. And then the brain science of the 70s, of the 90s and since, it's like, oh yeah, this is all true, right? And one of the mistakes we used to make was we'd say, well, these are values. And what they said is, no, these are actually universal human needs, right?
Yeah.
That we need these. And so I'm glad that resonated with you, because it really resonates with me in all of my work.
Yeah, well, and it's so funny when like really smart practitioners, start to put their finger on things and they're ahead of the neuroscience that
Yes.
on the reader, document
Yes.
identified. Okay. What advice do you have for high school counselors trying to manage a caseload of 280 students and competing demands to support students' social and emotional needs, post-secondary planning, and academic performance?
Well, that's easy, right? Well, here's what I would say, that I think, in education, we talk about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports. And tier 1 is supports that every student in the building receives. The way that I would go about that would be to really focus on creating communities of belonging. That being able to and having school practices, and it doesn't have to be a lot, but this is a tier 1. I don't think it's I'm not against having more social workers or more psychologists, but I think we're missing the boat with that. let me just,
Go down the line, like tier 1, like has to be population-wide interventions that everybody gets no matter what.
that's right. So one of the interesting things that a public health parable that has been meaningful to me has been, there are these two people sitting by the side of a river, and they look up and a child is drowning, and they dive in to get the child, and they get the child to safety. And they look up and there are two more kids in the river, and they dive in and they get those kids out, and then they turn around and the river's full of these kids. And to me, this is a metaphor for the mental health crisis, right? And so one of them dives back in and starts pulling kids out, and the other one goes up on shore, and the one in the water says, "What are you doing? I can't save these kids on my own." And the one on shore says, "I'm going upstream. We got to figure out why these kids are falling in." And so I guess what I would say is we need the people in the water. I think those are the social workers, those are the counselors. But what I would also say is that that we can quiet nervous systems. Mary Jo Barrett, she's a mentor of mine and a brilliant clinician, written a bunch of books. And what she really talks about is that in order for us, that there's a rhythm to our lives, and that we need to honor the rhythm. And there's times when we contract, which is we rest and we quiet our nervous system, and then times when we expand, right? And in our schools, we aren't taking the time to contract. We aren't taking the time to pause and ponder and connect. And that these are the things that then quiet those nervous systems. So all of a sudden you don't have the kids who need as much support. So that's where I would begin, would be
like literal upstream in that parable, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so frame it like in every classroom. One of the things I talk about is and it doesn't need to take more than a couple minutes, but at the beginning of the class, can we just quiet and catch our breath? Can we share something with another student to be connected in relation? So we're regulated, and then we're connected in relationship, and then we learn, and then can we pause again? So that and at the very end, can we consolidate that learning? And then can we connect with somebody else before we run into the hallway where there's 100 kids trying to get to different places?
I could not agree with you more. I think, we will always have kids who need high levels of care, but the more those resources can be saved for the kids where that, it was somehow unpreventable, or at least, and really keep more kids feeling good and solid and sturdy using upstream approaches, the better for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask you one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to just wrap the question for all of them. I suspect it's addressed throughout the book, but I'd love to hear how Dr. Bolton imagines how we can reconcile an embrace of community with our deep and abiding attachment to individualism. What role, if any, can schools play?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't. So here's one of the thoughts that comes to mind. So again, some of the language from the Circle of Courage, what they and I'm not going to get this right because they write about this so beautifully, but that when you're experiencing mastery, we are not in competition with one another. So we can, like, if I'm just trying to get better myself, I'm not threatened by someone else's success, right? I think that, I was struck by reading about George W. Bush's home in Midland, Texas. His dad was, an oil guy, right? Plenty of money. I think they had 3 kids, right? Was it 3 kids? But they had their house in the 1950s or whenever was 1,200 square feet, right? And now the idea of wealth, one of the things that we begin to identify wealth and success with how separate we can be from one another. We have gated communities that keep people out. We have, huge ranches. We've got houses where you have to call so that you can get your kid out of the climbing gym. So I think it's kind of a tragic irony that what we see as success. So I think that we can still have an individualistic spirit within a community. What people talk about when they talk about a belonging community is having shared values. We can have shared values and come together in community, but still want to thrive and learn and grow ourselves. I don't think it has to be either or.
I love that. Okay. here's the last question I'm going to ask you, and this is just from me. Um, if there were one thing that you wanted people to take away from this book, what would it be?
One thing, can I do two?
You have two or even three.
Three. Okay. So here's thank you for asking the question. Thanks for your flexibility. So I think the first one is just an understanding that the practices that we rely on and that we just take as second nature, when we really take a look at those, many of those are actually harming rather than helping the development of kids. And that we say, well, it worked for us, it worked for me. And I think that we, in a lot of ways, and it worked for North Shore Academy. We had all sorts of punishments and incentives, but I think we were successful in spite of, not because of those, if that makes sense. And I think that at different times it did a great deal of harm. And so I guess that relying on outdated and practices, I guess I hope that we can be flexible in thinking differently about those. And then I think the other piece is, I hope it's a hopeful book. I hope it's a book that can see, with the stories that I tell of students who really made remarkable changes in their lives, and that what's happening now doesn't have to mean it's going to happen. It's going to be what's happening in 10 years from now, that when we can create communities that can support and give kids resilience, then it's amazing what can happen. And it can happen when we're struggling and in each of our own lives independently, and it's certainly for our kids in our classrooms and in our homes.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you for writing this. Thank you for thinking with us about it. What a great, great bunch of ideas brought together in such a beautiful way.
Thank you so much. What a fun evening to be in dialogue with you. It's I've loved this. Thank you.
Okay.
So a couple notes. First of all, Lisa, thank you so much for your time. I know it can be tough to find time for really anybody, and I know that you're managing, got a lot of plates that are spinning at one time. So thank you so much for taking time for FAN tonight, and for taking time for our dear friend Doug Bolton as well. He's been part of the FAN community for many, many, many years. And as you saw from the questions and comments that were submitted through the Zoom registration form, he is beloved by many in the greater Chicago metro area. So thank you so much for slicing out some time for us tonight. Really, really, really appreciate it. I want to remind folks about a couple things. Doug will be spending another hour with us from 55 minutes technically, from 8:05 to 9 p.m. Central tonight. We call it After Hours. If you haven't ever been to After Hours, it is a conversation where people are there. You turn your camera on, you can ask your own questions. It's loose, it's lively. I'm the moderator of it. The way that you get to come to After Hours, because we're doing a big book giveaway for this book for Untethered tonight. The way you get to come to After Hours is make a donation to FAN, and whatever dollar amount is meaningful to you. So we've been putting in the link in chat for a couple times tonight. Just go to the FAN website, and there's a donate button there. Just make a donation. We'll see it, and we'll send you the link to join After Hours. So make sure you come, hang out, talk to Doug. There is so much richness of knowledge and experience that he has to share, and I know it's going to be a great conversation. I want to also make a note about a couple things, again, to remind folks, those of you who will be receiving a book, once we pick all the people tomorrow, you'll get an email from us, it's usually within 24, no more than 48 hours. Same thing with the recording. Recording will get pushed out to everybody within a day or two. Doug, I'm going to play a little dealer's choice here, if you don't mind. We have about 4 minutes left.
Sure.
I'm going to cover two things with you. One is a question that Damour put in chat, or excuse me, submitted tonight during the event. And she says, how do we help shift mainstream teachers' perspectives to adopt more empathetic mindsets and shift from punishment to regulatory strategies? So she's kind of asking, like, how do you shift teacher perspectives that way?
Yeah, so I think the first step is to help teachers' lives be more regulated. We've put a ton of pressure on kids and teachers, and when you take a look at research on the brains of people who don't get a break. It only takes from meeting to meeting. It only takes one meeting before that brain is dysregulated. And we've got teachers who are teaching back to back with passing periods of sometimes 2 minutes, especially in middle school. And so I don't think we're giving our teachers the time to pause and ponder, for their nervous systems to quiet so that they can then be more fully present. That's where I would start, actually, would be focusing on how can, because when we're dysregulated, we lose some really important things, and empathy is one of them. We can really love our family, but when we're dysregulated, we can say and do things because we lose, our nervous, our fight, flight, and freeze response is, empathy does not help with that. And so if we want them to be more empathetic, we quiet that nervous system for teachers as well. And we help them have time to connect instead of having to hit every learning standard as kids are struggling and asking them to do more and more. I would try and figure out, how can we ask them to do less and less, give them more time to connect in classrooms, give them, everybody, a chance to pause.
I appreciate that perspective. We have about, let's see, we got about 2 minutes. So I'm gonna just pose you a question that I'm curious about from in my professional position with FAN and being the curator of our programming. You do a lot of work consulting with a lot of schools, not just in the Chicago area, but both regionally and nationally. You talk to a lot of school administrators, a lot of teachers, a lot of staff. I'm wondering, from whatever you are identifying right now, what's front of mind right now within schools? It can be such a chaotic environment right now, broadly. But give me 2, 3 things that are front of mind right now for school leadership. I'd be curious about that from a programming point of view.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd say the two that really come to mind, and I think they're connected. Pre-COVID, 8% of kids were chronically truant. In Illinois, in 2024, 26% were. And so I would say that, and I think that's the second piece, is we've got kids who are disengaged, and only about a third of high school kids are engaged and feel like their work has meaning for them.
Yeah.
And so, and how that shows up in our schools is kids coming in and not being engaged. And if you're not engaged, that's the mastery piece. If you've lost mastery and you're not, it's not a place where you feel connected. Number one, why would I go? And number two, it's hard to sit there for 6 hours when you're not engaged, you don't feel connected. You've got to be compliant, and so you don't have any power. When you think about the circle of courage, that whole circle is broken.
Right.
So that's where I would go.
Lack of both status and belonging reminds me a little bit about David Yeager as well.
Yes. Yep.
I hosted him. All right, we're at 8 o'clock. Ding, 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 ding. So this webinar is officially over. Those of you coming to after hours, come make a donation to FAN. Come hang out with Doug Bolton. Pick that big brain of his. Lisa, we love you. We look forward to
Thank you,
welcoming you
Lisa.
back on May 13th when you will be in conversation with Susan Dominus. We cannot wait. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, everybody, for showing up tonight. We hope to welcome you back to FAN again sometime very soon. So thanks, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.